I want to tell you a story about video games. Do you know the one about how the entire industry was nearly wiped out? Okay, so the year was 1982. Business had been booming. The market for video games generated about $3.2 billion in revenue that year. A few years earlier, a company named Activision was founded by 4 former Atari employees who were unhappy with the recognition and royalty structure of that company. They'd subsequently won the right to make games as the first third-party publisher in America, which just means they could publish games for the Atari and that no one was going to get sued. In 1982, Activision released Pitfall, which was a game for the Atari 2600. It was an instant success, and it sold over 4 million copies. That kicked off a publishing boom in the video game industry. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of the action. And everybody was making money until the next year when the market crashed. Revenues dropped 97% to $100 million, all due to a flooded console market, an algal bloom of poor quality knockoff games, and increased competition from home computers. It eventually came to be known as the video game crash of 1983. As the New York Times put it in an article published in the fall of 1983, quote, "The electronic centipedes, outer space invaders, and spooky goblins that only a year ago seemed to have an extraterrestrial grip on the play hours of America's children are consuming each other like so many Pac-Men. Dozens of the game makers that rushed into the field last year have dropped by the wayside, their visions of high profits proving to be as imaginary as the fantasy worlds pictured on the game screens." This was, to put it lightly, catastrophic. Many companies failed, and it seemed like the video game industry was just another short-lived fad. At least until the late 80s, when the market started rebounding, largely because of Nintendo. Here's a PBS report on the subject from the winter of 1988.
Japanese-owned Nintendo of America has emerged as the industry leader. The company is based just outside Seattle, where it employs 275 workers serving the U.S. market. Its high-tech, high-profit products accounted for over 70% of all home video game sales in 1987. The company expects industry sales to double this year.
This, by the way, is why all officially licensed Nintendo games came with a gold seal of quality, because of the brokenness of the previous generation of games. Anyway, I bring all of this up because it feels like culture is shifting again. Games are more popular than ever. And I feel like we're at another inflection point, except this time it's not a crash, just a rocket ship. I mean, the Grammys introduced a new category this year for Best Video Game Soundtrack. The winner? Assassin's Creed Valhalla. It's fascinating to me, personally, because they definitely snubbed Beyoncé this year. Not the type of voters I'd expect to be very, shall we say, progressive. Regardless, 2023 seems like it'll be a big year for games, at least according to the noted conservative analysts over at Morgan Stanley. They're bullish. A recent research report from the bank sees the industry growing this year, even in the face of a recession. And I mean, their whole thing is maximizing investor value. But aside from the old guys who run the Grammys, or banks whose executives may or may not have caused the 2008 financial crisis, I think you can feel that impact further out in culture. Like, to me, it kind of feels like video games are relevant again, like in my daily life. I'll give you an example. I was at the office the other day doing very important reporting work when my colleague Natalia Winkleman, who also happens to be a film critic for the New York Times, caught me taking a break watching some people game on Twitch. For the real heads, it was the Valorant Champions Tour match between RRQ and Foot. Great game.
I love the idea of video games. I just read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow and got really into the idea of video games, but I've only been really into and good at 2 video games in my life. One of those is SSX Tricky. It is a snowboarding game. I don't know if I'm using the gaming terminology correctly, but it's like a racing snowboarding game in which you can choose a player and either race to the end of these different snowboarding tracks. And one's called Garibaldi. That's the first one. That's the easiest one. But then instead of racing, actually, what I like to do was try and get the most points by doing complicated tricks, snowboarding tricks.
Hence the name.
SSX Tricky, yes. And it would play the It's Tricky song when you got to when you like got your tricks up to like the highest amount. But I was so good that I would like immediately always get my tricks up. Depending on how good you were at the tricks, the like song would play more quickly. So be like, it's tricky. And then like if your performance was like a little bit, was getting poorer and poorer, it would be like, it's tricky. And it would like stop. It would just slow down to the point where it wasn't going anymore.
As a kid, I loved SSX Tricky for the same reasons. My trick meter was also always full. Anyway, I've always thought games were kind of a childish pursuit. Childish in the sense that childhood is a time to create and live in imaginary worlds. And games serve that up in spades. You can get lost in them. Even back in the 80s when they looked a lot less sophisticated, but inspired a moral panic about addiction.
Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, Super Mario Bros., Kid Icarus, and Metroid are among Nintendo's biggest sellers, but so far, none has surpassed Zelda in popularity. The game is a complex, high-tech adventure fantasy. It can take up to 90 hours to successfully complete, and it's not uncommon for kids to spend hours playing it non-stop. It's also not uncommon for parents to become concerned over video game addiction.
I would spend hours. Like, that's when I feel like understood the appeal of video games, when you're like, I could really get lost in this world. And then you like sort of come out of this daze and you're like, holy shit, this is like, I feel like I like sort of wasted, or like I would get anxious and be like, oh my God, I just spent like hours in this weird world that's not real.
Natalia told me she doesn't play video games anymore, though she did recently purchase a Nintendo Switch. Part of the reason why games are receiving a lot of mainstream interest right now is because the people who grew up with these titles are now in charge of major organs of culture. Like, 1983 was 40 years ago. To go back to that 1988 news report about Nintendo, there were a huge number of kids obsessed with gaming.
By the end of this year, we will have, I think, close to 90 or 95% of households with boys between the ages of 8 to 16. So that means if you see a boy on the street, he's got one in his house.
Some of those kids turned into adults who either never stopped playing or came back to games later in life. And some of those adults happen to, say, be Grammy voters, or people who greenlight shows at HBO, or even CEOs of game companies that are exploring bringing their IP to new mediums. With all that in mind, allow me to recite a brief and recent litany of video game things that have made it into the cultural mainstream. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, that novel Natalia mentioned, is a best-selling book about friends who design and develop games together. Amazon named it one of their 10 best books of 2022. Also last year, Paramount put out a moody TV series based on Halo, the franchise that has maybe sold more Xboxes than any other. It was renewed for a second season before the first had even aired. On a separate television note, this January, HBO released The Last of Us, a more or less direct adaptation of the wildly successful game of the same name. The series has generated reams of press and has seemingly won over the critical establishment, and, what's more, people are talking about it. It's become part of the cultural conversation, an acceptable answer to, what are you watching these days? And then, of course, there's Chris Pratt's upcoming role as Mario in the Super Mario Bros. Movie. The biggest, most bankable star in the world is playing the most famous video game protagonist of all time. While I personally don't think it's going to be, shall we say, a cultural touchstone, I do think it's important. It means something that the protagonist of a game published in the 8-bit era is getting a blockbuster movie in 2023. The current arbiters of culture seem to be saying, hell yeah, video games forever. Although, probably most important, gaming has also hit the YouTube makeup artists.
I watch a bunch of like beauty YouTubers and sometimes they are like, I'm reading a book, and all of them are like, I'm reading this book called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. And like, you don't have to know anything or care about video games to like this book. It's like interesting to see from other people who are like not in the world of games, like influencers and stuff, talk about this book.
This is my friend Nicole He. These days, she's an independent game developer and creative technologist who lives and works in Brooklyn. She's been gaming since Sonic 2 on the Sega Genesis, which she got when she was 7 and has still never beaten.
I think like now I probably could if I wanted to, because there's like modern save systems and stuff like that we can throw on top of the old game. But it's kind of insane that you were just expected to play the game for 8 hours straight and beat it without dying.
Nicole majored in journalism because she was interested in media, but she only got into the idea of making video games after she graduated, while she was working at Kickstarter and interacting with game devs every day. So she quit her job, went to grad school, and then ended up at Google, making what she called technology experiments.
And while people would react positively to those things, a lot of times I would make work, for my day job or for myself, and I would post on Twitter or something, and people are just like, very cool project, thumbs up. And that's sort of the extent of it. And I just felt like, for me, I wanted to go to the next level, I guess, with my work. I wanted more critical engagement with my work. And I wanted to make things that, just engage people more deeply. And the thing I realized was, how do you get somebody to interact with your interactive experience for more than 30 seconds? The answer is to call it a video game.
People, in other words, understand the framework and how they're supposed to engage with a work. Part of the challenge of these bigger, less subcultural adaptations, like The Last of Us, for example, is to figure out how to make something that was interactive into something that is not. Because if you solve plot or narrative problems with interactivity, the solutions don't translate to other media. Although Nicole thinks that some stories present in games are actually easier to tell in other media, because of something called ludonarrative dissonance. Ludo, which comes from the Latin word for game, and narrative, which means narrative. Basically, it's the disjunction between what a game's story is telling you versus what the game's mechanics actually want you to do. A fairly textbook example of this is The Last of Us, the game. So, the story, in brief, is about a man acting as a father figure to a girl. They're traveling across a post-apocalyptic America, blighted with mushroom zombies. And the whole game is about trauma and cycles of violence.
At the same time, though, when you're playing those games, it's a game where all you do is enact violence all around you. And not just that, but that's what is fun about the game, right? Is killing zombies and other human beings who get in your way is the pleasure of the game. And what's annoying about it is that, The Last of Us, I think, has a few moments where the game doesn't progress until it's okay, in order to continue playing the game, you have to, press X to brutally murder this innocent person. The nice thing about the show is that because it's not interactive, it can tell this story about violence and trauma and people trying to survive and blah, blah, blah. And because it's non-interactive media, you're not role-playing as any of the particular characters. We can watch it as a movie, as a TV show. It kind of works well for this type of storytelling.
You lose the interactivity, some of the more meaningful moments maybe of being Joel and Ellie, but you also lose the ludonarrative dissonance. Financially, it's also been a pretty good bet for HBO.
So when you're thinking about how The Last of Us has to, from a financial perspective, expand upon what success means for HBO, when you look at what it's doing for HBO Max, and I could run these numbers and I haven't yet, but the question is how many new high-value customers is it bringing in, and how many high-risk churn subscribers are they keeping?
This is my pal Julia Alexander. She's a media and entertainment analyst at Parrot Analytics, which mostly means she figures out where the industry is headed for her corporate clients.
I think where The Last of Us really succeeds is that the people who are into The Last of Us would probably already have HBO Max because there's probably a pretty strong overlap with the DC universe and a lot of the Warner Brothers films. But the level of customers that it is able to retain, who might have gone to Netflix afterwards, who might have gone to Disney Plus, is actually really crucial, especially in the United States where there is saturation happening relatively early in the lifespan of a streaming service. And so therefore retention is actually much stronger than acquisition. And so in that regard, what is The Last of Us creating value-wise and in terms of revenue contribution to a platform like HBO or HBO Max? It's going to be relatively significant. I would feel pretty comfortable saying that it's probably a high-value title for the company.
Julia thinks we're at a pivotal moment in the entertainment industry, where everyone is transitioning to direct-to-consumer streaming. The backdrop to that, which I think is super important, is that we're also in a moment of consolidation, which also makes for stronger IP. And when we talk about intellectual property, what we're really talking about is love.
What we think about when we think about IP is the monetization of love. Like what you're talking about is like, what are people so deeply devout to that you can charge them an insane amount of money and they will continue to pay for it? A way of thinking about this is sports rights, where you know that you can charge sports fans a lot of money and they'll pay for it because they want access to their favorite team. So if you think about it from an entertainment perspective, if you own like Warner Brothers Discovery, if you own HBO, which has, The Sopranos and whatever it might be, plus Warner Brothers, plus Harry Potter, plus Lord of the Rings and all these things, you can charge a decent amount of money and those fans will show up. And if you think about that in terms of gaming, if you look at Microsoft trying to buy Activision, if you look at kind of Sony playing in this space, what they're looking at in terms of a potential direct-to-consumer product is how much IP do we own that we could then charge higher amounts because people will sign up for it for access.
And we know video game IP is popular. The video game market today is exponentially bigger than it was in the late 80s. The market was valued at $195 billion in 2021. The other big thing here is that game companies have started to realize that their IP is valuable kind of at the same moment that other sources of intellectual property are running dry.
What I will say is that we have mined all other types of IP, right? If you think about really big books, those adaptations still happen, but they happen far less. Comic book characters are effectively owned by all the big companies, so you can't really do much comics. It's oversaturated. A lot of the other works, when you think about just different approaches into television to film or film to television, a lot of those are owned by companies already. So when you look at video games, it is the gold rush of the 2020s and the 2030s. And so I do believe that the gold rush era we are entering is going to get very, very competitive. It's going to get very, very backstabby, and it's going to produce a lot of video game adaptations over the next 5 to 10 years.
If you're a game company with strong stories and characters, you've got shovels to sell.
I think it's a bit of two different industries reaching for each other, right? Because, PlayStation, they have their own person in-house to kind of work on these deals.
This is my friend Megan Farouk-Manesh, who's a senior writer covering games at Wired.
I think that adaptations are a really good way for game companies to branch out if they want to not just... I think you look at a lot of game companies, I think Nintendo's a great example of this, where they're really moving beyond the games themselves to figure out what they can do. They just opened up a theme park, they're doing a lot of movies, they have a lot of projects in the works that aren't, even on mobile, that aren't exactly games, but are kind of oriented towards getting that gaming audience and then pulling them out and trying to get more of a casual audience. And I think with Nintendo especially, they really are coming into it with almost like a Disney-like strategy where they're not just making new games, they're creating an entire empire.
And I think part of the reason games are so popular among the people who play them is because you, yourself, are embodied in the world. Even if you can't snowboard, you're the person doing the tricks in SSX Tricky. Which also means that even in this IP gold rush, video game companies have something that more linear media doesn't.
I do think there is still something to video games themselves, because I think that by nature of what they are and the fact that you are playing them and you are in control, it does change your interaction with any kind of story or anything in the medium. So I do think there are still things that games do that TV or film just can't do.
Near the end of our interview, Megan mentioned a game called Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons. In it, she said, you control two brothers on one controller. Each brother has a slightly different control scheme, which takes a lot of getting used to. But eventually you figure it out.
So with this game, as you get towards the end, something happens and you can only control one brother, right? And there's this really beautiful moment where at first you don't know how to function. You've always been two people. And when you figure out how it is you're supposed to move forward, it's this incredibly touching moment that is built up on the entire game of understanding that it was a collaboration between two people and now it's about one person who has to take the reins. And it's an incredible moment that you just can't get unless you are physically there in that moment playing that game.
I have had at least 5 conversations this week about tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, which, I have to say, is more than I was expecting. Even in Brooklyn, where people are annoying online about being readers, it's rare to hear that so many different people are all reading the same book.
So what I think was cool about Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is that there is like a mainstreamification of video games, but not games themselves necessarily as much as like the development of video games and how much of that is a creative process and a collaborative process. And it's, an art form and practice in the way that I think making a movie is, or writing a book, or something else like that. And I think the book does do a good job of capturing the emotions of making a game, like what it actually feels like, what you're trying to express creatively, like how hard that is when you fail, when you succeed. I think it does a good job of that, and I think it's cool that it makes more like normies, I guess, have a glimpse into that process. So that has been quite interesting to see, like, how many people who don't care about not only video games but like game development, right, have a bit of an insight into this world.
So obviously the New York Times reviewed the book, and the person they got to do it was the perfect guy, I think. Tom Bissell, who's an author and a game writer himself. He called Gabrielle Zevin, the author of Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, a literary gamer, which is to say, someone for whom the act of reading and gaming are exactly the same pursuit. I mean, the name of the book is an allusion to Macbeth. Anyway, as Bissell put it at the end of his review, quote, "We merry dozens of literary gamers will cherish the world she so lovingly conjured. Meanwhile, everyone else will wonder what took them so long to recognize in video games the beauty and drama and pain of human creation." I don't think he's overselling it. Games are all sorts of things now. As the market has expanded, so too have the creators. There are all kinds of stories being told in games now that just weren't there before. There is the beauty and the drama and the pain.
If you have an idea of video games and you think it's still like a Call of Duty, for example, that's your idea, just like dudes playing a shooter on the couch, you're missing so much, because it's an outlet for queer creators and people of color to tell stories that they couldn't before. And so I think you find a lot of valuable stuff and a lot of valuable experiences you just don't get any other way.
And I think that's reason enough to pick up a controller.